Hello. In today's video, I'm going to continue the intake series, and today I'm going to talk about the 368 intake. Now, I know I don't do a lot of 368. In fact, I don't remember ever building a 368. I grabbed the intake. The 368 is throttle body injection, but this intake is aluminum. And if you are building a 368, then you might look in my links of other channels for Ray Soto, S-O-T-O. He did a 368, got rid of the fuel injection, put a carburetor on it, and he says it runs way better. And if you're having trouble with the fuel injection system, I can really see that. Now, like I said, it comes as throttle body fuel injected. It is an aluminum intake. As it sits here, completely untouched, this flows 144 CFM, so it's not a big flower. Now, this intake is one that I used, and it started out just like this. And I cut it out and put a carburetor on it, and Ray did the same thing for his 368. But I didn't run this on a 368. I ran this on a 500. And I know you're thinking, oh, that's crazy. It's an itty bitty little intake. It's meant for a small motor. And part of the reason I grabbed it way back in the day is, remember, we didn't have the Edelbrock. We didn't have an aluminum intake. And I kind of decided I wanted it because it was aluminum. I saw it out in the junkyard and I picked it up and I converted it to carburetor. And all I did was cut this part out and make a little plate that was holly flange and bolted it down as best I could. There isn't a lot of material, but I did as best I could, and then I used a really high quality RTV to also glue this adapter onto the top of the intake and seal it. And cut out, of course, all the insides so that I had an actual plenum. And I ran this with a 2-inch spacer on it. Seemed to run best with 2-inch spacer. So, I know, you're thinking, but it's still a 368 intake. And this particular intake, I ported. In fact, I put a lot of work into porting it. And I got it up to 175 CFM. Now, these ports are small. They're meant for the 368. And if you look at it, it doesn't have a lot of material in order to port it out too far. Now, the other thing that I struggled with a little bit are some of these little bends, because that's really where it was losing some flow in here. Now, I also did what's called equalizing. And that means I tested every single port on the flow bench, and I made sure they all flowed within about a CFM of each other, so that it was all nice and even. And that was also as high a flow as I could get without welding or doing something else to the intake. I just ported it as best I could to as big as I could and converted it to carburetor and ran it. And this particular intake caused a lot of controversy on the message board years ago. People thought I was crazy. This intake actually ran really, really well, and nobody believed me. I actually enjoyed this intake a lot. Now, one thing I like about it is it's a little more level as opposed to the uphill thing. So it kind of comes into the port a little straighter than like the regular factory intake. So it's not quite so shallow. It also kind of reminds me of the original Torker intake from years and years ago. But like I said, everybody's like, well, that can't possibly run. You're lying to us. You're wrong. And yet it ran really well. So much so, and they gave me so much grief, that there was a guy on the board that was running a quarter-mile car, and he was real good about testing and reporting stuff to the guys, and they all trusted it. And I wound up sending him this intake, this one right here, to run on his car. And he liked it so well, he bought it from me. He's like, I want to keep this intake. I like this intake. And so I sold him the intake with the stipulation that if he kind of gave up the Cadillac stuff, I wanted to have first dibs on buying it back. And when he did give up the Cadillac stuff and planned on selling the car off, he was a man of his word. He called me up and he says, you want to buy that intake back? And I was like, absolutely. Because I had a lot of work into this port-wise. I had picked up another one because I had thought about building another one. But when I got this one back, I kind of quit worrying about it. Now, I know you're saying to yourself, how could that possibly work? I mean, we've been talking about CFM on all these intakes. And this one's only 175 CFM. And we've talked about the fact that the stock head is 226 CFM at usual valve lift, and that the Edelbrock tends to flow about that. How could this possibly work well at all? And I know I harp on this a lot. I mean, I talk about airspeed. You're probably sick of hearing airspeed. But that's kind of how this works, and that's how the original torquer worked. The intake can be the point of most restriction. Now, typically they say when you build a motor that the valve is supposed to be the most restrictive point, and the port supports that and the intake supports that. Now, that's not always true. In the case of this, the intake itself, the runners themselves, are a little bit smaller than what we're using in the head. Now, the first thing I want you to be aware of is this was on a stock motor. You know, at some point, you are correct, it will not flow enough CFM to truly support a motor that's going to make a lot and a lot of power. But it ran really good on a stock motor with a cam. Now, the theory behind it is, first, how much of that CFM in the head are you actually using? Because a regular 300 horse motor or so is really only using this 175 CFM. And if the head flows more than the intake, the little bit of runner and bowl in the head can actually act just like a plenum. The cylinder will pull on that area. It'll start pulling on the runner. The runner's high speed. The valve goes shut. It kind of packs in behind the valve into the little pocket of the head, which is bigger than the runner, and starts the cycle over. So you can keep moving a little more air than what the port will flow, because over the time, remember the valve cycle is short. But this will kind of keep flowing for a moment beyond that, just like the carburetor does on filling a plenum. So it's basically like having a miniature plenum at the end of each runner. And you're like, I never heard of that. Why would you want to do that? Well, the torquer, like I said, was basically designed that way. And that's why it always had itty-bitty runners when you look at it. And eventually they came out with the Torquer 2, which was a little bigger runner, and that was partially because heads had evolved to the point where the Torquer 1 intake became a restriction. You could not make the horsepower out of it because it didn't flow enough. And this will have the same problem. This is really a funny thing that you can do if you're going to run just a stock motor. You know, stock motor with a cam. That's all I ran. I didn't port the heads. I had a slightly bigger valve on the seat just to clean up the seat. That was not really about flow, but that was to make sure that I had a nice seal, a nice freshly cut seat. So I made just a little bigger valve. Basically, stock motor with a cam. Now, the airspeed running through a runner helps it out. That closing point on the intake valve is when the piston's coming up. And that works best at high speed, high RPM, when the air is high speed. Because remember, as you go up in RPM, the airspeed in the motor goes up too. And so at real low RPM, you have kind of sluggish movement. That's why if you run a really big intake and you don't get the airspeed going, it runs really poor until the airspeed picks up. Well, this is the exact opposite. This has wonderful airspeed, and you can actually probably close that intake valve even later than I was doing with the little cam I had in it, and take advantage of the airspeed that's in the intake. And I think Terry's cam was a little bit bigger than mine, and it seemed to work real great on his car. The nice thing about having high-speed runners that are balanced and a halfway decent plenum, because this plenum is better than some of the other stock plenums. Plus, remember, this is a little more level, so we're straighter shot. We're not doing that uphill thing. It actually does better in filling the plenum and moving out into the runners. And the 2-inch spacer kind of helps that, because remember, this is high speed. So you still got to make that turn and get down into the runner. So by giving it a little space, you allow the air to kind of slow down a bit coming out of the carburetor and make this 90-degree turn it has to in the plenum. And sometimes that's not a bad idea anyway. Sometimes that's something you're fighting if the carb size is a little small. But I know this is kind of an odd intake for most guys to handle, and they have trouble understanding why it can work. And it's really meant, like I said, for a stock motor. Now, why would I want to maximize the airspeed? If you are at maximum airspeed at peak power with the intake, that intake's actually properly sized for the motor. That is where you actually want to be. And the reason is because below that point, at lower RPM, where naturally the airspeed is a little lower, it won't be quite so bad in the intake. So you wind up with better power below the peak because the airspeed is running a little better. Now, anybody that's put a really big intake onto a motor and, it doesn't clear up till, 2,500 RPM or 3,000 RPM, and sometimes they'll just figure out how to get past that RPM, and then they say the intake works. And if you look at intake RPM bands, some of them will say, 3 to 7. I mean, mostly small block stuff, not Caddy. But that really big one that I showed in a video is the same way. If you were to slap that on a stock motor, you'd have trouble at the bottom end because the air is just not moving fast enough because it's just a really big intake. If you can keep the airspeed up and not restrict the needed flow for the motor, then it runs really well. Because by keeping the airspeed up in the runner, you actually keep the air and fuel well broken up, and you have more oomph at the back of the valve for that closing point on the intake valve. Because remember, on any cam, you're closing past bottom dead center. So if you can keep the airspeed up, that minimizes any problems you have with that intake valve being open, and you may be trying to push air back up into the intake. And that is stopped by airspeed. And so you're always looking for this balance between just enough flow to do what you're trying to do and small enough that you have airspeed. Now, I recently posted a video on the 2.0 group, the Cadillac 500 472 2.0 Facebook group, about the cylinder head itself and why you may not want a high-speed cylinder head. And I did that partly because it just popped up, but also because I knew I was talking about this intake. And that really works in. The hard bend to make with airflow is that last 90-degree basically bend into the backside of the valve. You have the short side radius, you have the back of the valve, you got to make that turn, and you've got to get around the valve. And that is one of the toughest spots to deal with. And a lot of times you are better off opening up the bowl and the area around that short side turn a little bit, increasing the cross section so that the air slows down just a bit to help make that turn. Otherwise, what sometimes happens is you get the air flowing fast enough and it hits that short side and then it hits the far side wall and then you're only using half the valve. And so suddenly you wind up with a motor that when it gets way up in RPM at its peak, it suddenly isn't doing well because it's bouncing the air around right at the back of the valve. And so if you open it up just a little bit, it suddenly does a lot better in that spot. Now the drawback is if the intake's big and the runner's big and you open up that spot and you slow everything down, then at super low RPM, like at just off idle, you have trouble. And so I am always doing what I call the airspeed game. And you're playing with different intakes, and I wish they listed them more in what they flow. I mean, we've had to put more intakes on benches just to figure out that it probably wasn't going to work for me. But you play this game of different sizing of intakes to try and find that sweet spot between enough flow for what you're going to do and enough airspeed that the intake's really well behaved. And that's been part of the problem in making intakes for the Cadillac. It takes a lot of testing, it takes a lot of fussing around, but then you need to have an intake for different applications. In the case of stock, actually the stock intake or that 425 intake doesn't work too bad. This one doesn't do too bad either. And again, that's kind of a stock flow head. As you go up, then you're going to have to go to the Edelbrock intake. Even with its port mismatch, if you can try and fix that a little bit, it flows enough to get you up to, 550 horsepower or so. And then it starts having trouble. Even around 500, sometimes at the carburetor, it gets a little high speed and you can have some issues. But then what do you do to the next spot? And what we really need is like a very small single plane. I keep looking at trying to build a torquer, and we've done a few tests to try and find a sweet spot size that works well at that in between. Now, if you go bigger, if you go to Boogeyman heads, we've got the Bulldog style intake, which works real well for cast. And then you've got the really big 1475 intake that works well for ported, and then hopefully if we can get CNC monster ported heads, that'll be the sweet intake for that setup. So it's trying to find an intake for each application. Now, in Cadillac world, we struggle a lot because we don't have a lot of choices. And a lot of intakes are made without a lot of testing, which bugs me a lot. But the small block Chevy world, you have all these intakes to choose from. And that's exactly what we do. We kind of try and find a sweet spot intake that has enough airspeed, doesn't hurt our upper end, so it has enough flow, but it basically just flows enough for the horsepower that we're going to make. So you try and match, the airflow to about what the head has or just under in order to make it work. And that's what this was about. And I couldn't get anybody to understand that. And Terry, when he tested it, he's like, this thing works just great. So the theory and the idea of how it works really does work. I mean, that is the best way to try and build a motor. Now, you can find these in the junkyard, you can convert them, but like I said, remember, it's really only going to be for a stocker motor. And the other good news is it's kind of low profile, though I think it likes a little more plenum. So that's the 368 intake, and that's kind of the craziness that I did with this intake years and years ago. And I will tell you, I ported it big enough that it was a bit of a pain to get the seal at the bottom. There's just a little itty bitty lip there. But I did get the most out of it without spending a whole lot of money. And that was on a basically stock motor. And so it ran really well. And it wasn't just me that liked this intake. So you can kind of decide what you do. I have posted about this intake in the group before. And I know a lot of people have trouble understanding what this is. We tend to think, oh, I need a much bigger intake. And that was the thought when the Bulldog intake was built. Oh, I need a big intake. Well, they built an intake that's 360 CFM for a head, an iron head, that if you're lucky, you might see 320, maybe. But most of the 320 heads I put on my bench do not flow smoothly. They're surgy, they're not great heads. It's really 290 to about 300 is all you can really get out of an iron head. And this would probably even be too small if you did a bunch of that port work. But I know there's a lot of guys out there that aren't running ported heads. They're not planning on it. They're not trying to. They may not be trying to get everything out of the motor. I mean, it always sounds great. I want a 600 horsepower motor. I want a 500 horsepower motor. But a really good running, 320, 340 horsepower motor is actually really nice to drive. And that's part of the reason I had this on the car for quite a while, is it was just a joy to drive. It wasn't the fastest thing I had. The tunnel ram certainly did better when it came to wide open throttle, but it was a very well-mannered, well-behaved intake for what it was doing. And that was the exact idea behind the original Torquer intake, which is why it was called the Torquer intake. It was about trying to get, back in the day, carburetors were not huge. We really fought carburetor size. So by going to a single plane and got rid of that shearing, it helped run a smaller carburetor. And it kept enough airspeed going on a single plane that your low end power was still good, because that's really what it's about. And so it was called the Torquer because it made a lot of torque. It did really well down low. Now, if you got into racing on small block, you then wanted to go up to something bigger. And there was a bunch of choices originally in single plane in small block Chevy. You had, Victor Jr., the Victor, then you got up into some of the bigger race ones that companies made. And each one increased in flow. And that kind of kept happening because heads kept increasing in flow. Well, the same idea when you're building a Cadillac applies, is there's all those different flow rates. And if you throw something that flows 360 like the Bulldog on a stock motor that's only using, maybe 180 CFM, and the head may only be able to flow 226, it's going to have a really soggy bottom end because it's got no airspeed. And that was exactly what happened to the Boogeyman intake and why I wound up dividing it in half to try and make it work. So anyway, this is another choice. It's pretty low budget choice. Something you might want to play with if you're especially working at lower RPM. It is aluminum. It's lightweight. It's a little more level, so it looks a little better. I blasted this one. I had debated polishing it a little bit. Of course, they all come in the later model Cadillac blue. But it wasn't that hard to make. I just kind of cut this by hand. This is done before I even had a real mill, so this was really just done mostly by hand. And it is what it is. It's the 368 intake, and believe it or not, the intake like this runs pretty well. Now, remember, it's ported, so you got some work to do. If you run one like this, 144 CFM, well, yeah, you're probably not going to be real happy how that 500 runs. But if you want to try and make something work, and you want to try your hand at it, essentially you couldn't port it too big because there's just not enough material. That's really your big problem if you go to port one of these, is trying not to take out so much material that you wind up through the side. But that's the 368. I had lots of fun when I was running this, and I had lots of arguments started over this intake, and that's what I have. So I hope you enjoyed this particular video. It is kind of one of my favorite funny intakes. So we'll talk to you later. Have a good day.